once the enemy gets to the gate, it's too late. And we're finding ourselves right now, just like the UK did, and the US as well in 1940, before World War II, where we found ourselves suddenly faced with Nazis and Hitler. And we had to race to get ready for that. The US did, UK did, other allies did. And we're seeing the same thing today as we deal with Russia. We're having to race right now to get ready to be able to deter the Russians from doing other damage, other aggression besides what we're seeing in Ukraine.
At today's D-Day commemorations, the King paid tribute to the bravery and sacrifice of all those who fought on the beaches of Normandy 80 years ago.
Very many of them never came home. They lost their lives on the D-Day landing grounds or in the many battles that followed. It is with the most profound sense of gratitude that we remember them.
Well, what is the state of Britain's forces today? Could we deal properly, effectively, with any potential threat? Well, speaking at a D-Day commemoration event in Portsmouth yesterday, the outgoing head of the army, General Sir Patrick Sanders, said Britain just isn't ready for another global conflict. We can talk now to the military analyst and King's College Fellow, Professor Michael Clarke, and to Jim Townsend, former US Deputy Secretary of Defence. Professor Clarke, first of all, do you agree with what General Sir Patrick Sanders said yesterday?
Yes. I mean, when he became the Chief of the General Staff, the head of the army, he said then we have to mobilise. We have to be prepared to mobilise. And what he said, I remember I was there on the day when he made the first speech. He said, if we had to go to Europe, onto the continent now, we would be incredibly outnumbered. We'd be completely inadequate. We would fight like hell. But that's what we have to do. And he said, my job as head of the army is to try to mobilise the army. And he's done quite a lot in that respect. But the fact is, as he departs from being the Chief of the General Staff, the message is the same. The army can be as brave as you like. If it runs out of ammunition after 2 weeks, it loses. And that's kind of where we are, generally speaking.
And in terms of just the pure size of the British Army, I don't think it's ever been smaller. Well, it's about 72,000, 73,000, something like that?
Yeah. 72,500 was the target figure. They used to say, the Conservative government, when Michael Fallon was Defence Secretary, said, we have a base of 82,000. We won't let it fall below 82,000. And then the year later, we were being told that that is the aspiration to get to 82,000. And what it's actually done is drifted down to 72,500. And that was the level set in the Defence Review of 2021. So a base now of, we won't fall below 72,500. And I can tell you we're already below it because more people are leaving than are signing on. So the army is smaller now than ever since the Napoleonic era. And it is too small to do the sort of things that politicians say they want it to do.
Let's bring in Jim Townsend, former US Deputy Secretary of Defence. Mr. Townsend, do you believe the Americans feel that they could rely on Britain's armed forces if required?
Well, we can always rely on the British Armed Forces, and we always have. We've got a very close relationship. But as was just said, reliance is one thing. But being ready to go and do the deed that needs to be done, that's the problem, not just for the UK, but for the US and other allies as well. We've gone through a period where we felt war was just something from the past. After the end of the Cold War, we really took our eye off the ball. And over time, we now find ourselves not where we need to be if we want to be a strong deterrent. And we're racing now to try to do some of the things we should have done over the past couple of decades.
It is interesting, isn't it? Today of all days, that we're looking on our screens here in the studio at the great and the good, all very happy to attend these incredibly moving and important commemoration events. But trying to get a proper conversation going about defence spending in our election campaign, Mr. Townsend, is actually quite difficult. Most people just aren't interested. Why do you think that is?
Well, it's the same thing in the U.S. And in other allied nations, too, particularly. We have found ourselves struggling particularly in Europe, struggling to meet the 2% goal that NATO has laid out for allies in terms of the percentage of GDP that should go towards defense. It wasn't until Putin invaded Ukraine where we began to understand that we've got to stay ready. But the U.S. has the same kind of problem, too. Defense spending doesn't have a big constituency at home, whether it's public health in the UK or other issues in the United States. domestic needs always trump defense, particularly if the enemy isn't at your door. If it's not an obvious threat, it's hard for politicians to vote for increases in defense when there's not that enemy on your at the gate. But once the enemy gets to the gate, it's too late. And we're finding ourselves right now, just like the UK did, and the US as well in 1940, before World War II, where we found ourselves suddenly faced with Nazis and Hitler, and we had to race to get ready for that. The U.S. did, UK did, other allies did, and we're seeing the same thing today as we did with Russia. We're having to race right now to get ready to be able to deter the Russians from doing other damage, other aggression besides what we're seeing in Ukraine.
Michael Clark, President Putin was not invited to the D-Day commemorations today. I think we can all understand why. And it's also true, isn't it, that those countries that do border Russia, Finland, for example, have really had to change their tune about what they think about defence and what they do about it.
Oh, yes. I mean, one of the biggest developments in this crisis in the last 2 years is Sweden and Finland joining NATO. Remember, I mean, Finland has been neutral, non-aligned since 1945. Sweden has been non-aligned since 1812. And within a couple of months, they applied to join NATO, and they're now both members of NATO. So NATO has gone from 30 to 32 nations. And all of the northern members, so Norway, Sweden, Finland, the Baltic states, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Denmark, Netherlands, all of the northern states are very aware of the Russian challenge, and they take a very tough view of it. In the south of Europe, it's very different. You look at what's being said by the governments in Slovakia, in Hungary, in Austria. These people lean towards Putin. They talk about the need for peace in Ukraine, by which they mean let Putin keep everything he's conquered, and then we'll sit down at a negotiation and he'll tell us what else he wants in order to keep him sort of satisfied for a couple of years.
Yeah, so
there's a big difference between northern and southern NATO, and that difference is getting bigger as this war in Ukraine goes on.
That is really interesting. Jim Townsend, what would your take on that be?
That's exactly right. This is something that should cause us all to pause a bit, because the nations of the Nordic countries, traditionally have been seen as these countries that were the superpowers of peacekeeping in the UN, and they had a view of international relations where they were neutral. They wanted to stay away from Vietnam and things like that were part of the last century. But what we're seeing today, as was just said, is these nations that are very serious about their defense, who are very sober-minded, they are very concerned about Russia. They are doing so much within the alliance and in their region to improve deterrence, to put more money on defense. The Finns have never wavered when it came to dealing with Russia and being strong where they are in terms of their neutrality. Now they're part of NATO. Sweden is part of NATO. But in other parts of the alliance, as was just said, whether it's in the around the Black Sea area or Spain, Italy, Greece, they look on their threats as coming from immigration, from migrants crossing the Mediterranean, from terrorism. They've got another threat picture. So for NATO, unity is critical, that we all pull together, whether it is concerns about the South, as the Southern allies are, or up in the North. Poland, Romania are both concerned about Russia as well. We need to pull together as a unified alliance.
Yeah.
We have done that so far, but that's critical for all of us to keep our eye on the ball when it comes to where Russia's going.
Thank you very much indeed for your time. Jim Townsend, former US Deputy Secretary of Defence. Before that, Professor Michael Clark, military analyst and King's College Fellow. It'll be interesting to see if defence spending comes up in that debate on the telly on Friday night. Just a quick text from David, because it's a point worth making. Why were the people of Russia, or at least a representative, not invited to the ceremonies at D-Day? Because obviously the Russian people lost so many lives. And what was the statistic you mentioned yesterday?
27 million.
27 million.
Yeah, in the Second World War.
I mean, it is beyond our understanding.
It is, really, yeah.
It's a good point, David.